A cold morning in Iowa. It was just before dawn on May 15th, 2003, in the outskirts of Oakdale, a sleepy farming community nestled among the endless fields of Iowa corn and soybeans. The night's chill still lingered in the air. A thin mist floated above the blacktop roads and drifted across the emerald-green crops, blurring the boundaries between the earth and the sky. Out here, the hum of civilization was only a rumor, and the silence was as thick as the dew clinging to every stalk and leaf. Inside a small weathered farmhouse set a half-mile from the main road, Ruth Harris, 58, was finishing the last of her coffee. Her granddaughter, Olivia, a sprightly 6-year-old with unruly hair and a love for adventure, was already pulling on her red rubber boots, eager to join Grandma Ruth for their early morning walk through the fields. These walks were more than routine. They were tradition. For generations, the Harris family had walked these rows every spring and summer, checking the growth, clearing garbage, and exchanging whispered hopes about the coming harvest. Ruth shrugged on her faded Carhartt jacket, checked her phone, no new messages from her daughter in Des Moines, and unlocked the back door. She always felt a pang stepping out into the open, the cold air biting, the silence so profound even a bird's call seemed unnatural. But she loved these mornings, and so did Olivia, who burst from the porch with a shout, chasing after a half-seen rabbit darting along the hedgerow. As they walked, the ground squelched beneath their boots. The scent was rich and relatable to anyone who grew up in the Midwest: wet earth, sweet hay, diesel, and the faint tang of manure from a neighbor's dairy herd down the road. The mist hugged their ankles. "Grandma, will the corn be as tall as last year?" Olivia asked, twirling in circles as they reached the edge of a long, narrow irrigation ditch. Ruth smiled. "Maybe taller, if the June rains keep up." She stooped to pick a few weeds from between the rows, always vigilant, always caring for the land that had fed her family for decades. For a while, their conversation was nothing more than the random chatter only best friends share. School stories, favorite ice cream flavors, the progress of a family of barn swallows nesting in the old tractor shed. Ruth's mind habitually drifted to her worries: rising fertilizer costs, rumors of a new highway bypass that had sliced through the south field, and the health of their neighbor, Joe Turner, who lived just over the rise. Joe was famous on this stretch of road. 60 years old, full-blooded Iowan, he'd farmed and lived here all his life. His wife, Louise, had once been Ruth's closest friend, and their lives were intertwined by family cookouts, church socials, and more than a few shared tragedies over the years. Joe was the kind of traditional rural man people in the city only read about. Always up first, always working, always generous with his eyes, beer and a story, but rarely, if ever, talking about himself. That Thursday morning, there was no reason to expect anything but the ordinary. Ruth and Olivia circled past a cluster of white pines, crows calling overhead. The sky was lightening from black to indigo, almost time to turn back for breakfast, when Olivia dashed ahead. "Grandma, look!" she squealed, pointing to a patch of muddy grass beside the ditch. Ruth hurried over, instantly wary. It was rare for anything to be out of place here. Locals respected one another's space, and kids were taught from toddling not to stray into someone else's crops. In the silvery dawn, she could see Olivia standing with one rubber-booted foot planted beside an object poking from the mud. A single gray sandal, far too nice for farm work. Clean, stylish, almost out of place against the wet, black earth. Ruth frowned, immediately suspicious. She memorized everything left in her fields, and this shoe wasn't familiar. She knelt, carefully picking it up, her mind instantly running through the possibilities: lost by a guest, dropped by a passing motorist, or something else. Before she could decide, Olivia shrieked, a piercing sound that split the peaceful hush of morning. Ruth's heart seized. She spun around. Some 30 feet away, beside a tangled thicket of withering corn stalks left from last year, Olivia had stumbled backward, gaze locked on something in the furrows. Ruth dropped the sandal and sprinted to her granddaughter, arms out, instinctively shielding the girl from whatever she'd seen. She caught sight of it in the same instant. A body, slumped awkwardly on its side, half concealed by dew-soaked leaves, boots splayed, head tipped at an unnatural angle. The jeans were thick with mud, a battered plaid shirt stretched tight across unfamiliar, motionless shoulders. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking death's stillness. The world, for a beat, stopped turning. Ruth grabbed Olivia and hustled her away. "Honey, don't look," she whispered, fighting to sound calm, though tremors racked her body. But it was too late. Olivia, pale and shaking, clung desperately to Ruth's hand as they took one last look. Ruth braced herself. A farmer learns to handle livestock injuries, car crashes, and all manner of rural mischief, but she'd never seen a neighbor like this. Drawing a deep breath, Ruth crept forward. She recognized him at once. Joe Turner. There was no mistaking the shock of silver hair, the broad shoulders, the battered old watch, or the calloused, strong hands now curled loosely in the dirt. Up close, she noticed two other things that sent new chills up her spine: the faint, acrid tang of alcohol around him, and an eerie, sticky foam tracing the corners of his lips, a detail that would haunt her for weeks to come. He was cold. She reached for a pulse, more as a duty than with hope, but there was nothing. No breath, no movement, just stillness and the wet, implacable silence of dawn. Seeing Olivia's terror, Ruth swept her up in her arms and began walking back toward the farmhouse, boots thudding as panic gave speed to her tired legs. Her heart thundered in her chest, not just from fear, but from the sense that something deeply wrong had landed in their midst. Tragedy visited the farming community rarely, and when it did, the wounds went deep, festered, gossiped over, never truly forgotten in a place where everyone knew everyone's business. Behind her, the mist settled back. Somewhere far off, a truck rumbled to life. The sun had not yet risen, but the first rays began creeping over the horizon, casting the cornfields in golden light. It should have been a hopeful morning, but the land itself seemed to mourn, holding its breath as Ruth and Olivia ran for help. Within half an hour, the news spread like wildfire, passed by urgent phone calls, racing pickup trucks, and neighbors drawn to trouble like moths to flame. The Harris and Turner farms, the two oldest in Oakdale, returned to the whispered prayers and nervous speculation that had always shaped their lives in quiet times and in crisis. And so, a cold Iowa morning became the scene of unimaginable loss, a family forever changed, a town shaken to its roots, and a riddle from the heartland only just beginning. The police arrive and a community in shock. The sun was barely above the horizon by the time the first sheriff's cruiser wound its way up the gravel drive to the Turner place. The crackle of the dispatcher's voice had barely faded from the old radio in Ruth Harris's kitchen when the deep blue Ford Explorer, bright gold star on the side, pulled to a stop amid a cloud of Iowa dust. Sheriff Doug McClellan, heavyset in his windbreaker and Stetson, strode briskly toward the field that had, a scant hour earlier, been nothing but the backdrop for spring's gentle work. Already, farm folk had started to gather along the edge of the property, pickup trucks parked haphazardly on the shoulder, neighbors talking in the subdued, worried tones only tragedy elicits. Word always traveled fast in Oakdale, especially when whispers included the Turner name. A half-dozen faces Ruth recognized, folks from church, the feed store, even the high school principal, watched as she led Olivia into the arms of Louise Turner, who had only just run from her front door in a state of panic. Louise, still in her house slippers, shook uncontrollably. "I heard the commotion. I saw Ruth running. I thought maybe Olivia was lost or Ruth was hurt," she stammered, tears beginning to streak her cheeks beyond her makeup. Not Joe. Oh God, not Joe. Deputy Karen Whitlock knelt beside Louise, speaking soft words and gently but firmly guiding her back toward the house. Ruth, meanwhile, turned to Sheriff McClellan, her voice gritty and steady as she laid out what she'd found. Joe Turner's body, the odd sandal, the foam, the faint sour smell of liquor, all detail mattered. She knew the protocol, and the seriousness in McClellan's eyes told her he did too. The sheriff radioed in, requesting backup and the county coroner, then flagged a perimeter with crime scene tape brought for just such a nightmare. As more deputies began to arrive, one, then two, then three, the field became a ring of flashing lights and yellow tape. Community curiosity quickly edged into anxiety. The crowd of neighbors grew, voices rising, every theory and rumor already running rampant. McClellan kept his tone firm, but calm. "Folks, this is a crime scene now. I need you all to stay well back. Please don't go wandering out here. Don't cross the tape." He knew it was mostly futile. In small towns, tragedies turned into spectacles, and any break from routine drew people like deer to a salt lick. Still, his presence was reassuring. Oakdale had known Doug McClellan since he played football back in high school. There was nobody better to handle this quietly growing panic. Inside the tape, the forensics team spread out quickly, staking flags, snapping photos, and cataloging everything. The sandal, a faint trail of muddy footprints, a spot where the grass was pressed flat, another where the dew seemed wiped away. The medical examiner, Dr. Jennifer Klein, approached the body with the solemn diligence demanded by rural deaths. She checked the throat, the rigidity of the hands, the nearly colorless lips. Her face, when she looked up to McClellan, was grave. "It's unusual," she murmured, just loud enough for the sheriff to hear. "Bloat, a little livor, but not the sort of trauma you'd expect from a heart attack or a tractor rollover. No fresh wounds, nothing overt, except that foam." It took only a few hours for the shockwaves to engulf Oakdale. By mid-morning, the local Methodist church bell rang, less a call to worship than an echo of loss. Adults gathered at the general store or the hardware shop, whispering fiercely. Children, hustled off the school bus a mile away, were greeted by parents with trembling hands and firm directions. "You go straight home and stay there. Don't go near the Turner fields." People tried to make sense in the way only rural communities did, retelling Joe's virtues, debating the meaning of violence in a place that had always seen itself as immune to it. Some grasped at straws. Must have been an accident, right? Maybe he did have a stroke. Others were quicker to suspicion, a drifter, a robbery gone bad, or the echoes of old debts and broken friendships, resurrected from 1,000 church picnics and barbecues past. Throughout it all, the law worked methodically. McClellan and his deputies canvassed the area, interviewing those on scene first. Ruth, pale but solid as always. Olivia, babbling in confusion but already receding into shock. And Louise, who by now had been dosed with sedatives and was sitting rigid in her aging armchair, hands clenched, white. Inside the Turner house, the scene was unexpectedly ordinary. Yesterday's mail unopened on the kitchen table, a half-eaten pie in the fridge. But in the quiet, the kitchen still hummed with tension. A coffee cup left out, a dishcloth draped over the sink, and Louise's eyes flitting endlessly toward the door as if expecting Joe to stride in, laughing. Deputy Whitlock found the Turner son, John, by phone. Reached at a job site 2 hours away. His silence was heavy. Within minutes, he was driving home, urgency etched into every mile. Back at the field, as the day warmed and the clouds parted, the tide of community attention did not recede. Instead, it thickened. Investigators sorted through every bit of debris for clues. A cigarette butt, the remains of a sandwich wrapper, a crumpled napkin. Nothing was too insignificant. Farmer Pete Landry, whose cattle grazed just over the next hill, recounted seeing Joe the day before. He was right as rain, talking about fixing a fence. Marcia Beeman, who taught Sunday school in the church, whispered about an argument she'd overheard. Two men, one voice may be Joe's, but the details slipped through memory's cracks. Lunch hour came. Still, the field hummed with official activity, while Oakdale's main street all but shut down for the day. By now, McClellan had ruled out the obvious. No evidence of animal attack, no sign of an allergic reaction, no missing tractor or equipment. But two things didn't add up. The missing water bottle, which everyone agreed Joe always took out with him, and that strange, expensive-looking sandal. Crime scene techs dusted it for prints, puzzled by the pristine condition, and by the size, a woman's, not a man's, and yet found yards from the body. In the county's only cafe, speculation reached a fever pitch. Stories grew taller, conspiracies widened. Everyone with a grudge, a secret, or a random coincidence was put forward as a possible suspect. And over it all hung a deeper anxiety. If something like this could happen to Joe Turner, to Oakdale's Rock, what did it say about the world beyond their fields? Was no one safe anymore? That evening, as dusk settled, the authorities carefully removed Joe's body from the field, loading him into the county coroner's slick white van. Louise, John, and Ruth stood together on the porch, 3 generations shaken, each lost in private grief but still united by tragedy. A neighbor offered a casserole, others said prayers, or clutched hands, or just sat in silence. Oakdale was wounded, and everyone knew it. For the first time in decades, folks locked their doors before bed, checked their windows twice, and wondered, who could possibly have wanted good old Joe Turner dead? And how, in their peaceful little corner of Iowa, could evil have found its way home? Iowa Forensics, the mystery of a poisoning death. When the county coroner's van finally carried Joe Turner away from his own field, the anxious energy that had electrified Oakdale began to wane, replaced by a hush as heavy as the evening fog. Word spread quickly. Joe's body was being taken to Cedar Rapids, the closest city hospital with a proper forensic pathology lab. As dusk deepened, Louise Turner sat in the kitchen, hands trembling around a mug of untouched tea, while John and Ruth filled out forms and waited for the next phone call. At the Cedar Rapids medical examiner's office, Dr. Richard Madden was already prepping for a long night. Dr. Madden was a veteran in his field, respected for both his scientific rigor and his gentle bedside manner, the sort of coroner who could find humor at a crime scene, but never lost sight of the humanity in his work. He'd been called out to farm accidents, car wrecks, even the rare suicide, but homicide was a different beast entirely, especially poisoning. The autopsy began at 8:30 p.m. sharp, witnessed by 2 deputies, a forensic photographer, and a representative from the state crime lab. They wheeled Joe's body, still dressed in muddy jeans, plaid shirt, and boots, into the stark, chill light of the examining suite. Madden began in the methodical, almost rhythmic way he always did. Evidence bags lined the countertop. Fibers, dirt from the scene, the gray sandal found near the body, and, most importantly, a swab from the peculiar white froth that had alarmed Ruth Harris. Carefully, trainee Molly Green collected nail scrapings and combed for defensive wounds. Nothing, save for some mild abrasions from ordinary farm work. Next, Madden worked through the classic forensic checklist. External examination. He noted the purplish tint of Joe's lips and nail beds, a hint of hypoxia, a lack of oxygen in the blood. The skin was unusually pale, and there was significant hypersalivation evident around his mouth. No major trauma. No bruises, no stab marks, no swelling or bleeding beneath the scalp. Clothing. Joe's clothes were worn, but intact, their only abnormality a strong, acrid smell, a sort of chemical undertone, mingled with the faint sourness of spilled liquor. The preliminary findings seemed to rule out any violent altercation, If Joe had been attacked, it hadn't been with fists or weapons. But the foamy residue, combined with his blue lips, told another story, a hidden struggle within the body itself. Madden peeled off latex gloves and motioned for a closer toxicological exam. He made the Y incision, opened the chest cavity, and methodically removed samples of blood, tissue, and most critically, stomach contents. The moment he dissected the stomach, he paused. The lining of the organ was inflamed, patches of red, slight ulceration. The scent escaping was sharp, almost caustic, and a strange brownish liquid sloshed within, not the color of beer or whiskey, but of something altogether different. "Mark that. We're pulling everything for tox screens. Stat," he told Molly, who nodded and set about prepping vials for the lab. Madden continued, inspecting the respiratory tract. The lungs were congested, the throat slightly edematous with some chemical erosion, all signs suggesting the inhalation or ingestion of a toxic substance. As the clock ticked on, he mentally crossed off the possibilities. Opioid overdose? Unlikely. Heart failure? The muscle seemed healthy. Stroke? No hemorrhaging. All the evidence pointed to one thing: poisoning. In a small town like Oakdale, poisonings were almost unheard of. Everyone knew what paraquat or glyphosate looked and smelled like. Dangerous, yes, but people were careful. Yet, as the forensics team examined the bottles stored at Joe Turner's barn, one container was notably missing: the heavy green thermos Joe always brought out to the fields. Madden double-bagged every sample and had them rush downstairs to the hospital's midnight shift toxicology lab. He also requested a routine ethanol screen to confirm or rule out the possibility that Turner's death was merely the result of an alcohol binge gone wrong, though he had his doubts. Suspicion gnawed at him. The alcohol scent was odd, strong but inconsistent with heavy drinking. Meanwhile, Oakdale simmered. Deputy Whitlock and Sheriff McClellan spent long hours interviewing neighbors. Marcia Beeman had said, maybe it was a heart attack. But Pete Landry, whose own son once nearly died from accidental pesticide exposure, wondered if something more sinister was at play. Could have been the chemicals. I tell you, I wouldn't let my own grandkids near that stuff with a 10-foot pole. Back in the lab, the toxicology process chugged ahead. First, a rapid test confirmed only trace amounts of alcohol in Joe's bloodstream, not nearly enough to explain his death, or that telltale foam. Next came the full poisons panel: organophosphates, pesticides, heavy metals, industrial solvents. Finally, close to 3 o'clock that morning, the results rang through. Dr. Madden read the printout, leaned back, and frowned. Paraquat, the highly restricted deadly herbicide, notoriously used in the Midwest, was present at lethal levels in both Joe's blood and stomach contents. He called Sheriff McClellan directly, despite the late hour. "Doug, it's Doc Madden. Joe Turner was poisoned. Acute paraquat ingestion. Enough to bring down a horse." There was silence on the other end. "You sure?" the sheriff eventually replied. "Certain. No way he did this by accident. Dosage is through the roof. I'm sending the official report with chain of custody documentation. And you're going to want that thermos." By sunup, McClellan called an emergency meeting at the station, a rare event in Oakdale. The news hit like a landslide. Not only was Joe's death suddenly a homicide, but the method was so cold-blooded it chilled everyone to the bone. Poison wasn't the act of a robber or a highway stranger. It was personal. It suggested planning, deep knowledge of the victim, and an intimate chance to get close. The following days were a blur of scientific procedures and small-town apprehension. Laboratory analysts from Des Moines drove down, confirming the Cedar Rapids findings. The paraquat's chemical fingerprint was unmistakable, pure, undiluted, likely poured or mixed just before ingestion. The implications were staggering. Nobody on the Turner farm would have confused a thermos of water with pesticide, unless someone had done it for them, or had access to the bottle in the quiet bustle of a farm morning. Meanwhile, every glance in Oakdale took on sharper meaning. Ruth, recalling the single unfamiliar sandal found at the scene, wondered who had been in those fields before dawn. John Turner, reeling in grief, turned his focus to helping investigators reconstruct Joe's last day. Louise, locked in her room, clung to the hope of an accident, refusing for hours to believe her world had been shattered by murder. Dr. Madden, working late in his cramped office among shelves stacked with logbooks and pathology texts, typed up his report. It was clinical, factual, but he could not shake the realization. Someone had fed Joe Turner his last drink. Someone, likely close, had watched him walk those fields for the last time. The poison already working its evil beneath the surface. As the town's trust began to fray, and the Turner family's grief boiled into fear and confusion, one mystery became clear to everyone in Oakdale. Joe Turner had not died by chance. Somewhere in their close-knit world, a world where everyone's business was supposed to be known, there was a secret and a killer, still hiding in plain sight. Subtle clues, secret fault lines. The Turner family. Wasn't the American dream, after all? From a distance, it was easy to imagine the Turners as a kind of American ideal, the same one you'd see in farm supply ads or church circulars. 3 generations under one roof, cornfields rolling into the horizon, a weathered yellow farmhouse standing guard over their slice of Iowa. But as the investigation into Joe Turner's death widened, the cracks beneath that postcard surface began to show. The Turner home, usually a kind of epicenter for Oakdale gatherings, now felt haunted. Louise Turner rarely left her rocking chair by the living room window. Her son John returned from work in the city with shadows under his eyes, moving with the grim determination of a man shouldering everything at once. And Emily, the daughter-in-law, kept herself busy to the point of exhaustion, eyes darting anxiously whenever the phone rang. Oakdale law enforcement, along with a state investigator out of Des Moines, took their time with this family. They didn't push too hard, not right away. Grief was a delicate thing, but every tragedy left ripples, and the officers gently began to sift through the muddy waters of Turner family life. Sheriff McClellan, who'd grown up himself just one town over, knew that in small towns, secrets didn't hide in darkness. They just lived in the blind spots of routine, of neighborly glances, and of polite, tight-lipped smiles. Emily Turner, the outsider, within Emily Turner, 28, was in many ways the heart of the Turner household. She was not originally from Oakdale, but a transplant from Dubuque, with a degree in elementary education she'd never used, a quick wit, and the beauty that drew stares at the county fair. Her marriage to John had seemed a match made in heaven, at least at first. He was handsome, reliable, ambitious, and she brought new energy into the house. But as months turned to years, and John's job as a civil engineer took him away from home for weeks on end, the spark faded. The isolation of rural life pressed in. Emily blossomed in town, helping at the library, teaching Sunday school, participating in the women's quilting group. But behind closed doors, things were less idyllic. Neighbors gossiped, sometimes idly, sometimes with concern, about raised voices drifting through open windows on summer nights. How John seemed to withdraw further with every argument. How Emily, with her city clothes and smartphone, was different. Even Ruth, who loved Emily as her own, noticed the tension. She never seemed to sit still, Ruth once told Deputy Whitlock. If she wasn't with little James, she was cleaning, or fussing in the garden, or firing off texts on her phone, like she was racing something she couldn't outrun. John Turner. The dutiful son. John, 31, was as much a fixture in Oakdale as the grain elevator, but success took him further afield. Civil engineering jobs carried him all over eastern Iowa, and even when he was at home, the stress of providing for his family, working long hours, meeting deadlines, kept him at arm's length. He and Emily tried for more children, but after 2 miscarriages, quietly stopped talking about it. Their son, James, now 4, was the cherished center of their world, but the pressure told in other ways. His relationship with Joe, his father, was classic Midwest, respectful, measured, and filled with the kinds of things men could build or fix together, instead of words. Still, some noticed a wariness in John, as if he feared falling short of his father's quiet expectations. The night Joe died, it was John who took on the responsibility. Police, funeral director, distant relatives on the phone, without complaint, but also without visible emotion. Louise Turner, matriarch in mourning. Then there was Louise. At 57, she embodied a particular American hope, perseverance, quiet faith, and the strength to weather any storm. But now she seemed adrift, her routines unspooling. She played reruns of her favorite old TV shows late into the night. Sometimes she forgot to eat. She clung to the past, convinced some big city stranger must have struck at her husband, or that it must be a mistake. Anything, almost, to avoid. Seeing the walls of her own home as the prison of secrets that perhaps she'd helped to build, brick by brick. Subtle clues, uncomfortable questions. As law enforcement reviewed every detail of the Turner routines, small inconsistencies emerged. According to Emily, Joe always took his green thermos, the one with the faded Massey Ferguson sticker, out to the fields, and he always filled it himself. But the morning he died, Emily had been in the kitchen making breakfast for James, and she couldn't remember if she'd seen Joe fill the thermos or not. Maybe he did it before I got up, she guessed. Louise, meanwhile, said she heard someone in the kitchen, way earlier than usual, but that could have been anyone. On the phone, John offered little. Dad was in a good mood that week. Emily and he argued a bit over how to train the dog. Not unusual. You know him. He was stubborn. But when pressed, he recalled a moment, just days before, when Joe had walked away from dinner unfinished, muttering about not trusting the world these days. John shrugged it off. He had that side sometimes, paranoid. Then came a more specific lead. Ruth remembered that just last Sunday, she'd spotted an unfamiliar car parked at the end of the Turner Drive, a dark blue sedan with county plates not from Johnson or even the neighboring counties. Could have been a delivery, Ruth admitted. But that's what's so odd. Joe never ordered anything, and Louise couldn't recall expecting company. Investigators canvassed the road and nearby farms, but came up dry. Still, the small event stuck in the minds of detectives. Who had opportunity, knowledge of the property, and access to Joe Turner's daily routine? Old wounds and new suspicions. It wasn't just strangers and schedules either. The detectives learned that despite the public surface, there had been rifts within the Turner family for years. There were whispers of money troubles after bad harvests, an uncle who'd gambled away half an inheritance, a sore subject at family reunions, rumors of Joe's old-school discipline, of resentments over land divisions, of arguments over the future. At a potluck years ago, someone had seen Joe and Emily heatedly debating in the barn, Emily's face ashen and fists clenched. Emily later said it was about the upcoming harvest, but her unease lingered. The communal air shifted. People who'd always trusted one another now looked side-eyed at the Turner house. Who really knew what had passed within those walls? The American dream, revisited by week's end. The traditional dinners, the big lawn games, the image of the perfect Midwest family had all peeled away, exposing quiet disappointments, private battles, and secret longings. Perhaps the Turners were never picture perfect. Perhaps nobody is. Maybe, investigators mused, the real American story is composed of secrets and fault lines, and what we're willing to lose to keep them. As the sheriff looked again at the evolving family picture on the Turner fridge, with its forced careful smiles, its arms just a little too loosely draped, he realized he wasn't staring at a clue. He was staring at a warning. Even in the best-looking families, Darkness could thrive just beneath the surface, hidden until it demanded to be seen. And finally, in the quiet wake of murder, Oakdale had no choice but to look straight at it. A figure from the shadows, an old friend returns, and a secret affair. The Turner family was still reeling from the shock of Joe's death when Oakdale found itself abuzz with new, darker rumors. For Sheriff McClellan and his small team, the forensic finding of Paraquat poisoning was as chilling as it was clarifying. This was not an accident, not a tragic case of mistaken identity, but the calculated act of someone who lived and breathed in the same close-knit world as Joe Turner. Still, even as suspicion ricocheted from one branch of the family tree to the next, it turned out that the person who would upend the investigation wasn't a Turner at all. The stranger among us. It was Deputy Whitlock who first noticed something odd the day after Joe's funeral. The mourners were mostly family, or longtime friends, faces Whitlock had seen every Sunday for decades. But there, lingering at the edge of the church parking lot, was Mark Holloway. Mark had always been a bit of a drifter, even though he'd been born only a few miles from Oakdale. Known for picking up odd jobs, roofing, auto repairs during the summer, handyman work in the winter, Mark had been away from town more often than not, living with cousins in Des Moines or working construction gigs in Illinois. He was tall, with weathered skin and a tired sort of charm, the kind women once said was wasted on a troublemaker. He'd last left Oakdale years earlier, after a fallout with his stepfather, and few had expected him to show his face again. Yet here he was, not just at the funeral, but soon spotted walking old routes around the Turner place, hands in the pockets of a battered Carhartt, ball cap pulled low over his brow. Some thought nothing of it at first. Mark was, after all, the type to appear and vanish with the seasons. But others whispered, "Why come back now? Why was he hanging around town instead of moving on?" Old ties, new tensions, digging through old yearbooks and hire sheets. McClellan and Whitlock discovered that Mark, now 33, had attended Oakdale High, the same years as Emily Turner, then Emily Rowe. They'd even worked together one summer at the McLeod family's sewing factory, now shuttered and overgrown. Mrs. Linda McLeod, the former supervisor, recalled the two as always laughing, a little flirty. Back then, Mark had a car, a taste for mischief, and a collection of parking tickets. Emily, barely out of high school, was a new arrival from Dubuque. On a hunch, Whitlock reached out quietly to Emily. Her answer was, measured. "Yes, I remember Mark, but we haven't spoken in years." Her smile was quick, brittle. "He was just a work friend. Honestly, I was surprised to see him at the funeral." John Turner, questioned later, shrugged. "Mark? I barely know the guy. He worked on the new roof last spring for about a week, but nothing more. Emily didn't mention he was back, though." His words trailed off, and the disconnected edge to his statement didn't go unnoticed. A pattern emerges. Within days, another detail surfaced that drew Mark deeper into the investigation. Pete Landry, the cattle farmer, reported seeing someone who looked like Mark Holloway near the Turner's tool shed just at dawn, 2 mornings before Joe's body was found. "I thought he might be helping with repair work," Landry told the deputies, but he scurried off the minute he saw me watching. Sheriff McClellan decided it was time for a talk. Mark was found outside the Sinclair station, smoking a Lucky Strike and gazing blankly at the empty road out of town. He agreed to come in for a chat, his answers short but always polite. "I just came for the funeral, Sheriff. Joe was good to me. Used to let me hunt on his land, help out in the summer. I was fond of him." When asked where he'd been the morning of Joe's death, Mark's gaze shifted. "I was out walking. Couldn't sleep. You know how it is after someone passes. I got back to my mom's around sunrise. She'll tell you." A secret affair unveiled. It was in the days following this conversation that the secret at the heart of the case began to unravel. Linda McLeod, whose sharp eyes missed little, mentioned, almost as an aside, that Emily and Mark were thick as thieves during the McLeod factory days, often seen sharing rides home or sneaking off behind the building at lunch. They acted like they had some kind of secret. You know how young people are. The detectives pressed further, checking old phone logs, combing through social media, and when they subpoenaed Emily's cell records, a pattern emerged. Dozens of calls and texts, often late at night, over the past 3 months, just as Mark had reappeared in Oakdale. A neighbor, Hattie Drew, told deputies she'd seen someone she thought was Emily climbing into a truck outside the edge of town around midnight 3 weeks before the murder. Could have been anyone, but you know how these things stick with you later. She looked nervous. When Deputy Whitlock quietly confronted Emily with the evidence, she crumbled. Tears flowed. Panic overtook her practiced calm. Into the web of motive. As the affair came to light, new possibilities began to click into place for the investigators. Emily had unmonitored access to the Turner kitchen and, critically, Joe's thermos. Mark had long-standing knowledge of the farm's layout, as well as connections to rural supply shops selling industrial pesticides. Bluntly, together, they had motive, means, and opportunity. When pressed about her movements on the morning Joe died, Emily admitted to being in the kitchen, alone, preparing oatmeal for James. She claimed not to recall seeing the green thermos, but evidence from the forensics team, smudged fingerprints consistent with her own, told a different story. As for Mark, he was unable to account credibly for his whereabouts during the crucial hour when investigators believed the poison was planted. Surveillance from a nearby farm captured a pickup matching Mark's on a back road less than a mile from the Turner property at sunrise. The stories around Oakdale began to swirl anew. Now it was not just grief and gossip that filled the air, but judgment. The American dream, Oakdale realized, could rot from within, its collapse invisible until the moment the secrets came pouring out. The shadow beyond the cornfields. For Joe Turner's friends, the truth came as a double blow. The trusted family, the quiet wife, the drifter they'd half forgotten, a triangle of longing and resentment, spun irreversibly out of control. In the end, the shadows that haunted the Turner land weren't those cast by the towering corn, but by hearts turned hard, by loneliness, by love misplaced, and by the fatal promise of escape offered in secret, after dark. If Oakdale had ever believed evil couldn't take root in its fields, it would now have to reckon with the memory, indelible and haunting, of the friend who came back, and the love that should have been left in the past. High-stakes confrontation, and a shocking confession. The investigation was at a boiling point. The sheriff's command room felt tight with the scent of strong black coffee and mounting nerves. Task force maps covered one wall, pushpins charting the sequence of Mark's early morning movements, and Emily's anxious detours around town. Printed text logs, fingerprints, and grainy security footage. The puzzle pieces of a crime so personal that everyone involved approached it with a mixture of dread and resolve. Sheriff McClellan called for both suspects to come in for questioning, but not together. The conference room was walled by faded motivational posters and a buzzy fluorescent light. Deputy Whitlock brought Mark in first. Hands cuffed in front, Mark slumped in the plastic chair, the very picture of small-town burnout. His Carhartt jacket smelled of engine oil and cold sweat. He tried for defiance, but exhaustion and fear hollowed out his bravado. Whitlock wasted no time. "We have you on camera, Mark. Within half a mile of the Turner place the morning Joe died. Your phone pulled a tower near the farm at sunrise. You want to tell me why?" Mark sneered, banged his cuffed hands on the table. "Just driving. I went out to see the stars. Bad habit." She pressed on. "You were seen sneaking behind the Turner shed. Pete Landry is sure he saw you, right around 5:20 a.m., and one of your gloves was found in the ditch. Just say it. You had business with someone on that farm, right? Mark hesitated, his jaw set tight. You got nothing. I was alone. Emily didn't know I was even... Whitlock seized on it, her voice suddenly quiet. That's not what Emily told us. We've matched text messages, late-night calls. We know about the affair. And guess what? We also know Paraquat showed up in your truck. Traces on a pair of old boots in your toolbox. Mark's face drained of color. He licked his lips, glanced at the observation glass, his bravado bleeding away. He wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Meanwhile, in a separate interview room across the hallway, Emily sat rigid beside a bare metal table, twisting a tissue in her hands. Her face, pale and shadowed, betrayed the cost of weeks spent hiding, fearing, not just the law, but the collapse of her world. John's hurt, James's confusion, and the death on her conscience weighed heavier than any handcuff. Sheriff McClellan entered and set down a neat folder. He opened it, showing her photographs, the thermos, the chemical analysis, the fingerprint match. His voice was as gentle as it was firm. Emily, it's time to stop running. Mark won't protect you. Not anymore. He's already implicating you. We know you had access to the kitchen. We know you filled Joe's thermos that morning. The paraquat in his body matches pesticide from your own supply shed, and a single fingerprint. Yours was underneath the lid. Emily broke, her shoulders shaking. She shook her head no, then yes, then buried her face in her hands. I never meant... I just wanted it all to stop, she choked. He said, Mark said it wouldn't hurt, that it would look like an accident. We're not here for stories, just the truth, McClellan said gently. He pushed the confession form across the table. Tell us what happened. Between sobs, Emily began her confession, slow and stumbling, but damning. I put it in. The paraquat. I opened the thermos and poured it in. He was in the barn. I had time. Mark waited by the road. He told me to throw away the bottle, to wipe the counters. It was my mistake. Mine. Realizing the tide had turned, detectives brought the confessions together. When Mark learned Emily had confessed, his defenses crumbled. In a cracked voice, he admitted to orchestrating the use of paraquat, claiming Emily did it only because she feared discovery. Both of their affair and the lies that had woven into the Turner family's life. He painted himself as the mastermind, Emily as the desperate accomplice. I told her it'd be easy, Mark said. I got the pesticide. She just wanted a way out. Detectives leaned into the details: how, when, and why. Mark described scouting the property, watching as Emily moved through the kitchen, signaling him by text when the coast was clear. He waited, hidden behind a row of grain bins, ready to retrieve and bury any evidence. Afterward, he helped destroy the bottle and wipe down the thermos. He admitted to planting a bottle of cheap whiskey near Joe's body as a decoy, hoping to draw suspicion away from poison and toward an innocent accident. Emily's story, while overlapping, pulsed with anguish and confusion. Her version was fraught with second guesses and guilt. The plan, she explained, began as desperate talk, late-night complaints exchanged over anxious texts. She said she never truly believed Mark would go through with it. But once the idea was set in motion, she found herself swept along by fear, loneliness, and an overwhelming sense that everything was already too broken to repair. The legal team built the final timeline with surgical precision. Early morning hours. Mark arrived via back roads and stashed the paraquat outside the Turner barn. Emily, acting on Mark's cue, spiked the green thermos while fixing breakfast. Mark lurked out of sight, gathering discarded bottles and, later, scattering evidence along the ditch lines. After loading whiskey by Joe's side, he left, never to see Joe alive again. For investigators, the confessions provided both clarity and a deep unease. What seemed like careful plotting was revealed as a tragic tangle of indecision and selfishness, spiraling into murder. The pair gave up details. how Paraquat was sourced using Mark's side job at a farm chemical supplier, how Emily rationalized her actions, telling herself no one would ever suspect her, not in a town like Oakdale, and how the two grew more terrified with each day until their secrets finally bled out in confession. The confrontation ended with Emily sobbing uncontrollably, Mark silent but trembling. Deputies led them from separate rooms to be booked, two people forever severed by the consequences of their own making, their faces ghost pale under the harsh booking lights. Ruth watched, distant, the grief now tinged with bitter closure as she realized how the illusion of safety had blinded them all. In the eyes of Oakdale, the story had moved from shadowy suspicion to terrible truth, a lesson writ large in heartbreak and the damage wrought when needs, fears, and betrayals go unchecked. The price paid, the tragic aftermath of an American family. When the dust finally settled after the confessions and arrests, Oakdale found itself cloaked in a kind of silence it had never known, one heavy with sadness, disbelief, and an unsettling sense of collective loss. Newspapers from Des Moines to Chicago ran headlines about the sensational case. A respected Iowa farmer murdered by his own daughter-in-law and her secret lover. A former Oakdale native returned from obscurity. National audiences feasted on the drama, but for those who had lived beside the Turner family for decades, the shock was raw and intimate. The trial, held in the Johnson County Courthouse, became the emotional fulcrum for the community, a public stage where all the private heartbreak, betrayal, and anger spilled out under harsh fluorescent lights. Every day, townspeople filled the benches, their faces tired but resolute as they listened to the litany of evidence. Mark's purchase of Paraquat using a borrowed name, Emily's text messages spelling out hope, despair, and the final damning arrangements. The jury was out for only hours. Emily Turner was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Her composure, the same tight smile that had charmed Oakdale's church ladies and school kids, finally broke the day the verdict was read. She wept openly, head bowed, as the deputies led her away. Mark Holloway, his role as the ringleader irrefutable, was handed 20 years as an accessory. His defense lawyer asked for leniency, citing trauma, hardship, and lost years, but the eyes of Oakdale saw only the man who had shattered their faith in each other. The judge's gavel rang out, and with it, generations of certainty about right and wrong seemed to collapse. The personal toll was incalculable. John Turner, who had once embodied his father's stoic work ethic, withdrew into himself. He rarely left the farmhouse, and when he did, his face was pinched, distant. Louise, robbed of husband and daughter-in-law in a single season, aged visibly. Her hair turned silver in a matter of weeks. She clung to her grandson, James, now an orphan in all but name, the boy's questions about his parents unanswered and unanswerable. There was property to be settled, debts to manage, and farmland to tend, but the rhythms of rural life offered only hollow comfort. The Turner homestead, once known for laughter and raucous Sunday dinners, became a place visited only out of necessity. Casseroles and sympathy cards arrived at first, and then, as news cycles shifted, so did the distance between the Turners and their neighbors. Old friends stopped coming by. Oakdale, wounded, turned inward. For months, the sound of the farmhouse's screen door echoing in the stillness seemed to say, "Nothing is certain anymore." The community itself had been forced to confront all the things it prided itself on hiding away. The way grief festers, the consequences of isolation, and the fragile nature of the moral codes people once took for granted. Families looked at each other with new wariness. Friends double-checked old confidences. The minister at the local church, who had once declared Oakdale sheltered from the world's darkness, stood before his congregation and wrestled aloud with doubt. No sermon could answer the children's questions or restore the town's sense of innocence. And yet, gradually, a different kind of resilience began to take root. John, for all his pain, found solace in his son's small arms and in the ritual of tending his father's fields. Louise joined a grief support group, finding comfort among others who knew what it was to lose too much. The next planting season, neighbors came together, not to gossip or speculate, but to help get the corn in on time. There was less laughter now, but more honest words. The Turner murder left a scar that shaped the town and would never truly fade. People learned the hardest way that family isn't a guarantee against tragedy, and that love, in its absence or in its betrayal, can become the sharpest blade. At auction, the Turner implements fetched little. The farmhouse, after a season untended, began to sag. But inside, old family photographs remained. A grinning Joe in overalls, Louise as a young bride, John and Emily, arms intertwined beneath the autumn maples, little James, this tragedy's unwanted heir. In time, Oakdale became slightly less naive, but perhaps a little stronger, too. When city journalists stopped by to hunt for follow-up stories, they found no one eager for the spotlight. What happened in the Turner fields had become, in a way, a private matter again. A lesson marked by gravestones, altered routines, and a wary determination never to assume that evil always comes from outside the circle. For the Turners, and for Oakdale, the cost of that lesson, measured in lost trust, broken bonds, and unanswered questions, was nothing less than the high price of loving and losing in America.